Hello, folks. Long time no see. How's everybody doing? I'm not going to start straight away because I can see we're still waiting for people to pop on over. But if you've just come over from the quarantine choir sing, well survived. That's not easy music. I think that's, in fact, no, I don't think. I know that's the hardest piece we've attempted on quarantine choir. And maybe I suppose maybe Zadok the priest was pretty tough. But my goodness, such wonderful, wonderful music. And the way that Bach weaves those lines together so expertly and so effortlessly is the thing that I still, after all these years, and I've been studying Bach's music for a while now, as you'd imagine, I still find it startling just how amazingly he manages it. Now I'm just going to just click a button here and just, yeah, that's slightly off centre. But how is everybody doing? You still here, Ruth? And if you are, lots of love to you. I'm really sorry that you're not very well and struggling with the COVID. And yeah, we're all just sending you lots of love, thinking of you. I hope Matthew is making you, well, actually, no, I hope he's not making you breakfast in bed because that's just the worst, isn't it? Oh, dear. So, hello, everybody. Blello, blello. Hello, Julie. Hello, Anna. No, you don't need chairs. Well, you can just sit or whatever you like, everybody. Perch. The number of times as a music teacher I started a session and I would be sat in my teacher's chair, and of course I had a throne-like teacher's chair. I'd say to people, well, just come and sit, and some of my students would sit at tables, others would lie on the floor, others would lie with their heads in their hands, typical classroom. So however you want to arrange yourself, make yourselves comfortable, everybody, and I think we'll get started. I hope you enjoyed the Bach, everybody. He is well, for some people he's a bit of an acquired taste, but without this gentleman here, music would not sound the way it does. So thank you everybody for coming over and having a little listen to this bit, because Bach is immensely important. And so we started last week this deep dive into history, which of course is something that I think a lot of us find interesting, particularly when it comes to music, but they don't cover, I don't think they cover the important things in curriculum music. And by the time you've left school, well, there aren't many places where you can actually learn this stuff now. So Bach, well, I think we've all heard of him. He was the youngest child of a very large family. The Bachs were always composers. And by the time the young Johann came along, he had several composers in his family, and he was, as the youngest, he was largely ignored. Born in 1685, that's an important year for those of you who study Baroque music, same year as Handel, and same year as several other composers, actually, who were really, really important to the Baroque era. Born in Eisenach, and was orphaned by the age of 10. And that's a really important aspect when it comes to Bach. As with all of these composers, you have to remember that although we lionize them and we worship them almost, they are and were people. And I had a lecturer at university who actually in front of us took out one of these sort of little porcelain busts of Bach and smashed it on the ground in front of us, and it was a real sort of, what are you doing? This is the late 90s, and all around us were portraits of these great composers, and he said one of the worst things the world ever did to turn the composers into these little statues. He said, because you literally, if you look at these busts of Beethoven and Bach and so on, they're always on a pedestal. They're always literally on a pedestal. And we treat them as if they were superhumans. We talk about the pantheon of great composers, these great humans. They were people. And Bach, more I think than most, put his humanity, put his pain, put his suffering, his loss, his joy, his love, everything into his music. So orphaned at the age of 10, lost both his parents. His father struggled with alcohol abuse, something that would come back to haunt Bach in later life. So Bach grew up with his brother, one of his older brothers, who raised him. And unlike Handel, who struggled to be taken seriously as a composer, obviously Bach, coming from a family of composers, he found work quite easily as a student in and around Eisenach, playing for churches, playing for services. It's the kind of thing, if you could make an organ make sound, well, there was work for you. I think, as Bach once memorably said, is all you need to do, I love this, all you need to do is to press all the right keys at the right time and the instrument plays itself. Very wise words, Johann. So anyway, Bach started out as a musician. All right, a lot of composers struggle to get into the field. Bach started out as a musician, and he worked as a musician for his entire life. He had what we think of as three main eras, three parts of his life where he was working in a particular place and produced a certain amount of music. So those eras were Weimar, Kürten, and Leipzig. Now, in each of those areas, he produced a body of work. The Weimar years produced a lot of his instrumental music, a lot of his concertos and so on. The Kürten years, a lot of the keyboard music, and the Leipzig years, a lot of the sacred music, particularly the cantatas for the St. Thomas Kirche. So all of these pieces I'll be talking about are kind of grouped into early, middle, and late Bach. Now, he produced the most incredible body of work in his 65 years. And I've got a little list here on my slide. You can see major works. Now, after this, if you're interested, if you just go and look up, just Wikipedia, I mean, there's so much on there. If you just look up Johann Sebastian Bach and you just look at a list of compositions, it goes on and on and on and on and on for pages. Bach worked incredibly hard. If we compare him to last week's composer, was Corelli, who works just as hard but produced a very small amount of work because he was just constantly revisiting and polishing. Bach didn't do that to the same extent. That's not to say he didn't produce polished work, but he was a working musician and he was working incredibly hard. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So the major works that I would recommend if you're brand new to Bach, or if you've only just, for example, just sung this fugue today, the major works that I think are so important. Well, the first are what are known as his 48 preludes and fugues, and I've got a slide on that in a minute. They are so important to the development of music and to the way that music sounds today. The Brandenburg Concertos are some of the most incredible music ever written. And again, I've got a slide, I'll tell you about those in a moment, but it's also a really tragic story, so hold on for that one. The Goldberg Variations, this beautiful piece for keyboard, made famous by Glenn Gould, if you've ever heard his interpretation of it. The Goldberg Variations, again, are just beautiful, so clever. And in fact, in this very famous portrait of Bach, he's actually holding I think it's the 10th variation. I can't quite see, but he's holding one of the Goldberg Variations there. Bach's also well known for writing the Passions, these huge choral works that many of us have sung, and the B minor Mass and the Cantatas. So just an enormous body of work. He worked so hard. Now, before we move on and we learn some more interesting facts, I thought I'd share with you, and these are genuine. These are answers written on a British GCSE music exam paper. A couple of these I saw myself. Okay, so these are some quotes. So the first is, Johann Bach wrote a great many musical compositions and had a large number of children. In between, he practiced on an old spinster, which he kept up in his attic. Now, Bach did indeed have a lot of children, but he had an old spinet, which is a keyboard instrument, in his attic. And when he was a child, he used to go and practice on that. I think the young person who wrote that answer was a little confused. This is one that one of my former students wrote, and I'm still in touch with him and I still mock him. Bach died from 1750 to the present. That's a great GCSE answer. Bach was the most famous composer in the world, and so was Handel. And this is another one that I have added to the list, which is not about Bach, but Handel was half German, half Italian, and half English. He was very large. So there we are, everybody. I just thought I'd share the wisdom of young people with you before we move on and talk a little bit more about Bach. So I am going to talk about his works in a minute, but I want to talk about what it was about him that made him so important. Now, I've mentioned these 48 preludes and fugues, and we've just sung a fugue on Quarantine Choir. And the thing is with a fugue, it is a very complicated bit of construction, but at its heart, what it is basically is voices that interact, that interweave and work together. If I can just show you on my slide here, here's a little bit of a visual example of a piece of 3-part counterpoint. So we read the scores from left to right. We can see this top line here. That's the top line. Okay, second line is, if I count 3, 4, 1. Oops. Something like that. And then the bottom line is 3, for 1 and. So each of those lines has its own character. The top line, long, slow moving lines. The bottom line is sort of jumping off the beat, and this middle one is all fiddly. So it's 1, 2. So it's like the filling and the sandwich. So what does that sound like when we put that all together? Well, let's have a little listen. So we've got the top line. Let's have the top line on its own. So on its own, it's perfectly nice. Now we add the second voice. We start to hear the interaction. Here we go. And now if we add the third line as well, you start to hear that the parts are giving way to the others, where one part is prominent, the other one pulls back and moves in the spaces. So this is 3-part counterpoint. And. You see, so that's the example you have on screen, played one voice at a time, and then it all fits together. And that was one of the amazing things about Bach. He had a brain that understood music at its fundamental level. He was famous for being able to take a melody, any melody, and to improvise on it, to create counterpoint out of it on the fly. To be able to see not just, well, this is the tune, but this is what the tune sounds like backwards. This is what the tune sounds like in a different key. This is what the counter melody sounds like. This is what the counter melody sounds like. In fact, one of his sons, and he had many sons, Carl Philipp Emanuel and Wilhelm Friedrich and so on, and we'll talk about them another day. His sons used to say that he was a terrible attender of church and cathedral services when he wasn't playing, because he would just sit there in the service as the organist was playing and hear the music and say to his children around him, well, that's wrong, and would sit there writing out and drawing the staves and writing out how it should have gone. I mean, you can just imagine, being an organist playing and being told Herr Bach is in the congregation. You think, oh no, because he was just that kind of individual. He was a very, very prickly character. He was very he's quite belligerent, and we'll talk in about 5 minutes or so about why he ended up in prison. And he was quite fond of his drink, so you can probably gather why. But as a master of counterpoint with that amazing brain, what Bach did is Bach revolutionized the way that we think about music. Not with his compositions, that came later, but what he did with his compositions. And so let me tell you quickly about the WellTempered Clavier. And you may well have heard of this collection of pieces. If you go to any reputable or even some disreputable music shops, you will find the WellTempered Clavier. It's 2 volumes, Book 1 and Book 2, and each contains a collection of pieces, what we call preludes and fugues. Now, we know what a fugue is. We've just been singing one. A fugue is where you have a subject that comes in, and then that subject comes in a fifth apart, and you have interaction, and you get that polyphony. A prelude is just an expression of music on the instrument. So a very famous prelude is his first prelude in C. I think most of us have heard this. And so on. And so a prelude is a nice little piece in that particular key. And so Bach wrote, this is the important thing, Bach wrote a prelude and fugue for each key of the chromatic scale. Now that might not sound like anything particularly important, but it was massively important at the time. So he wrote a prelude and fugue in C major and C minor, in C major and C sharp minor, in D major and D minor, and so on and so forth, all the way up. So each piece had 48 pieces, and there were 2 books. Now, what's important about that is, at the time, this idea of fixed tuning didn't really exist, or it was a new idea. And we've spoken on deep dives about music theory, about why scales work the way they do. It all comes back to this fundamental series, this harmonic series that is built into nature. Now, the early keyboard instruments and the early organs and the early spinets were not tuned equally, by which I mean the distance between the notes was not exactly the same. And there's very complicated reasons to do with harmonics as to why that's the case. But you could, in theory, play something from 100 years before Bach's time, and it would sound fine if you played in C major. But if you tried in another key, but because of the way the instrument was tuned, the notes would sound out of tune because it was not tuned equally across all the notes. The space between the semitones was not the same. Now, this equal temperament idea means that you lose some of the resonance, you lose some of the harmony by tuning equally. And there are people today, and certainly musical traditions all around the world, India for example, that still use what's called mean tone temperament, where you tune to the resonance of the instrument rather than to a fixed pitch. But Bach saw the value, saw the, I suppose, the benefits of a system where you could be certain if you played a chord on any note, it'd sound consonant, it would sound in tune. And so Bach was a real fan of the well-tempered tuning, where the space between each note was the same. And so what he did is he wrote all these pieces to be played on an instrument that was tuned equally. And if you are if you're over 30, you will remember the battles between VHS and Betamax tapes back in the 1980s. There were two competing formats for video cassette tapes, and there was VHS and Betamax, and people used to say Betamax was much better quality, but in the end VHS won. Why? Because more people bought VHS players. Why? Because there was more stuff to watch on the VHS players. And it's the same here. Bach wrote these pieces, and they are so good, people liked them, and importantly, teachers saw the benefits of using them to teach students, because they're a mixture of styles and a mixture of difficulties. So you could start with that first prelude in C, and that's fine, and then ones of grade 3 can play that all the way up to pieces in, F sharp major and so on. So Bach kind of dragged all of music into this new era by writing and publishing these pieces. Everybody bought them, and that means everybody needed an instrument that would play these pieces, which brought this equal temperament to the world, established it firmly, and we can trace it back to Bach. Now, I think that's amazing, and we owe him a huge debt. We now listen to music that sounds the way Bach intended. If he hadn't done this, if mean tone temperament had won out, music would not sound the way it does today. So I think that's amazing, and I'm going to give Bach a little smattering of applause for that. But that's not all he did, ladies and gentlemen. That's just one of the things that he did. So let's very quickly talk about concertos. Actually, no, do you know what? No, I'm going to play you a little bit of this. I'm going to play you a tiny bit of a prelude, because you've listened to me witter on. So we're going to listen to the wonderful harpsichordist Young-Hae Kim playing a little bit of Bach's prelude in E flat major. So this is from the WellTempered Clavier, and this is played on a harpsichord. Okay, here we go. Take it away. It's sheer sacrilege to fade Bach out, but I'm going to have to. There's no easy place to stop. If it was a bit of Vivaldi, there would have been some block chords already, and we would know we could fade out without losing anything. The thing about Bach is, you can probably already tell, his music is so much more elaborate, is so much more intricate than these early Baroque sounds. I mean, a friend of mine once memorably said the thing about Bach is he writes these incredible melodies which touch your heart, but you could never whistle them. You know, you might be able to whistle a bar or two, but you know, beyond that, it just goes. I mean, just think about it. Try and whistle. Those of you that know the Brandenburg in G, da da dum, ba da dum. If you try to whistle that, you just lose it after a few bars. That is typical of Bach, and his music sometimes can be difficult to break into. But I tell you, the thing is about Bach, as I've said, his heart is in every single bar. Let me tell you a very quick bit about his cantatas, everybody. Now, the thing is, Bach, as I've said, he was a jobbing musician. He was working every single hour of his professional life and his personal life. He was working. He was not, although we now consider him to be this amazing composer and one of the greatest to ever live, at the time he was not held in high regard. He was considered to be considerably inferior to the other musicians of his time. And in fact, when he got the job as the Kapellmeister at the Thomas Kirche in Leipzig, the interview panel, they actually wrote notes about him, and they wanted to get they wanted Telemann for the job, and Telemann was the Andrew Lloyd Webber of his day. You know, he was a big star, and he turned them down. And they actually wrote something along the lines of, I had the quote, I'm afraid I haven't got it up on screen, but something along the lines of, we wanted the best, but in the end we had to employ a mediocrity. And they're talking about J.S. Bach. So that goes to show you the kind of people of the time. They didn't appreciate the level of intellectual and musical genius that they were dealing with, and they thought that he was mediocre. Well, anyway, Bach had to work incredibly hard to feed his family. He had lots and lots of children, as we said. He had 2 wives, one of whom tragically died in childbirth. His second wife, Anna Magdalena, he very famously wrote a set of music for her to play, the Anna Magdalena Notebook. But with so many mouths to feed, and really with not a great reputation, Bach had to be industrious. And so one of the things that he did most famously is he wrote several cycles of cantatas. These are church pieces to be performed on a Sunday morning with full instrumentation, sometimes for choir and soloist, sometimes for soloist and instrument, depended who was available that weekend. The music was usually composed fresh that week, including all the fugues, all of the parts. He had to write his own manuscript paper out and then write all the parts out. Sometimes he would give them out to the musicians on the Sunday morning, and the ink would still be wet on the pages. I mean, just imagine the amount of work that he had to do in order to do that. So between 1707, which is when we know he wrote his first cantatas, and 1745, which is 5 years before he died when he wrote his last one, we know of at least 200 that survive, but there were hundreds more that he wrote. And just think about, I mean, it's one of the tragedies of humanity is how much of Bach's music has been lost to time. But at least we have those 200. Now, each work consisted of, as it says here on the screen, multiple movements, chorales, fugues, all composed within a week. They are often staggeringly beautiful. We have sung several cantata movements on the quarantine choir. So what we know as Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring is actually a chorale called Jesus bleibet meine Freude. And we've also sung the chorale from Wachet auf. Well, this is something very special. I'm going to play you just the first minute or so of one of Bach's cantatas. Now, if you are in the self-isolation choir, and if you sang Elijah the other week, you'll know the wonderful piece It Is Enough from Elijah. Well, that piece was based very much on this next piece, which is called Ich habe genug. And it is for oboe, for strings, and for solo bass voice. Let's just have a little bit of this. And remember, this was written for a Sunday morning, just a regular Sunday morning, by this Kapellmeister that the people who employed thought was inferior. Have a listen, everybody. the voice.
Ich habe genug. Ich habe genug. Genug, ich habe genug. Ich habe den Heiland das offen, ihr Frommen, auf meine
Okay, and again, I'm afraid it's awful and so awful to have to fade that out, but do look up that cantata. Ich habe genug. I have enough. I've taken the Saviour, the cross into my life. I have enough. But you can hear that Mendelssohn himself took that idea, the sad chords, the solo instrument. With Mendelssohn, it was a cello. With Bach, it was an oboe. That was his human voice. And that solo baritone line, that bass line, Ich habe genug, you can hear what influenced Mendelssohn. And you can also hear what I was saying earlier on about a melody that touches you so deeply, but you couldn't whistle it, you couldn't sing it unless you had the music in front of you. That is Bach's genius. He takes us, he draws us in with an idea, and then he just wraps us up in it, and we are just we're in his power, under his spell. Now, if you've not heard the cantatas, they are all available to listen to. Lots of them are available on YouTube. Perhaps the one of the greatest exponents of Bach this century has been John Eliot Gardiner, and his Bach Cantata Pilgrimage is phenomenal. Do please watch that. Now, everybody, I've got 2 more minutes. I've overrun slightly, and I'll be finishing in a moment, but I just want to very quickly talk to you about concertos, and I promise to tell you about why Bach ended up in prison. So, concertos wise, Bach left a number of amazing concertos for solo instruments and groups of instruments and orchestra. Again, a lot of them were lost to time. He wrote a lot of concertos for oboe, which we don't have anymore, and several violin concertos have been lost, but what he's left us is remarkable. The violin concertos in A minor and E are exquisite. The double violin concerto in D minor, the second movement from that is I think is the music of the universe. It expresses everything of humanity. It is perfect. The Brandenburg concertos, these were written as a job interview. So Bach desperately has spent a lot of his life trying to improve his lot, trying to provide for his family. So the Brandenburg concertos were written as a job interview to the Marquis of Brandenburg. And this is the really sad thing. We are pretty certain that Bach never heard them played. He wrote them, he sent them to the Marquis of Brandenburg with a really fawning letter. Okay, I humbly beseech you to bestow upon these humble works which I've scratched from the dirt, that sort of thing. Now, this elector, this chap, ignored them, put them in a cupboard. Okay, the Brandenburg concertos, the greatest expression of the Baroque era, was sent to this chap who didn't know what they were, and certainly from all accounts didn't have musicians who could go anywhere near the quality to be able to play them, so he put them in a cupboard. They were discovered long after Bach's death, and just interestingly, those of you who know about your science and your space exploration know of the Voyager probes and the Mariner probes that are leaving our solar system, and on the Voyager probes Carl Sagan memorably put a gold record. You remember that? And on the gold record are the sounds of Earth, and there's sounds of children, there's sounds of native African drumming and all sorts, and there is a bit of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 2. It is the furthest outpost of human exploration and human expression. It will outlive our planet by billions of years, this record. Bach never heard it played. How about that? And just to finish for today, everybody, I promised to explain to you about why Bach ended up in prison and who he was. Well, as I've said, he was quite a belligerent soul, as well as this incredible genius who could write music that just brings the tears and touches you deeply. And when he was working in Weimar, he very much wanted to leave that job and wanted to go and work elsewhere. This is quite a common theme with composers. I'll tell you about Haydn another day. And he got into an altercation with the Duke, okay, and called him all sorts of unpleasant names. Some people say he took a swing at the Duke and ended up in prison for 4 weeks. Now, during that time, We understand he wasn't kept in a horrible cell. He was kept in quite a comfortable debtor's prison. But this is what we know: there was no instrument, no harpsichord, and he was ever so bored. And this is where he wrote a lot of the Well-Tempered Clavier in his head in prison for 4 weeks. I just think that's marvellous. He also started plenty of fights. There's evidence that he once went down to the town to start a fight with a viola player, I think it was, in the tavern, who'd been rude about his music, and just walked in and punched him in the face. That's the kind of man that Bach was. But at the same time, he's also a man who was orphaned at 10, saw his first wife die in childbirth, lost I don't know how many children before the age of 4, suffered so deeply throughout his life, was ridiculed by his colleagues, was largely ignored by the musical society. When he died, his music fell into an obscurity so that was shocking to us now. If it weren't for Mendelssohn learning Bach's music as a technical exercise as a child, I mean, that's how he came to know it, we wouldn't know Bach as a great composer. We'd only know him as a great organist. So I am so grateful to have learnt about Bach's music, and I still consider myself at the absolute beginning of my journey. I could spend the rest of my life studying the music of Bach and learning to play it, and I would still consider myself not to be worthy to kneel at his feet. He was one of the greatest musical geniuses, if not the greatest musical genius of all time. So everybody, I hope you've enjoyed that. I could talk and talk and talk and talk for hours, but you're all busy people and you've all got lives to lead. So I shall leave it for today. Next week we'll look at another style. I think we'll carry on in the Baroque era, because there's so much we can talk about there, but we'll talk about another composer next week and another style. So I'm back tomorrow. Well, actually, I'm back a lot today. 5 o'clock, I've got a Christmas rehearsal, and then Lift Thine Eyes for self-isolation choir, so I'll see you for that. Otherwise, 2 o'clock tomorrow, everybody, we're going to learn a lovely Welsh song and go around the world. So enjoy your day, everyone. Take care, Ruth. I hope you're feeling much better soon. Similarly, Kit Kat, hope you feel better soon. And take care, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye.